Yeah, the main point here was not using principle of explosion. I didn't use principle of explosion. I'm pretty sure I made that clear. What I was using was paraconsistent logic, and within the framework and analogy I gave, it was a not using principle of explosion. I just referenced it and how we can get a contradiction from that. But then I referred to the analogy to fix the said contradiction, where I use paraconsistency to have the contradiction coexist and then get fixed via the said paraconsistency. So, say for example, I gave the example about bread, right? The bread is in one hand, not in one hand, but is in my hand, right? But then I say it's not within my hand, right? So that would be P and not P, as I already explained. So once we have this said contradiction, right? We can fix it via paraconsistency and say that it's not within my other hand, but it's still within my other hand. So the two limbs, right, are distinct from one another and are two separate parts of the body because we have one arm with one hand, and then the other hand which holds the bread. So the totality of this conclusion, the whole of it, would just be pure consistency. I didn't use principle of explosion to support contradictions being logical. So, principal explosion doesn't necessarily have anything to do with my argument, but I understand what you're trying to say of principal explosion. So, I'm just saying I don't see a point of bringing it up again. Yeah, that's what we refer to incoherent things. So it's just not rational law and does not apply to any type of logic. So it would be external to that set of logic. So these contradictions or these set of impossibilities cannot exist. So that alone is a impossibility. There's no such thing as an illogical contradiction. I should add, by the way. I feel like that's an oxymoron. Where you're just like putting together new terms to create a newer term with a new meaning. I get what you're saying though, but even then, it's just classified as an impossibility. There's no other thing referred to it. So the contradiction itself, so say for an example, the composite within there you're asserting. So say for an example, I have a apple, right? And this apple, right? I say that this apple is gonna be a human, right? But it's contradictory itself. Um, I wouldn't say that's like entirely coherent. I mean, it's logically possible, but logical possibilities itself cannot have a contradiction itself. So you could say it's a logical impossibility because logical possibilities itself cannot have presented contradictions. And but like, there's no other composite which can fix that. Like, so yeah, generally that'd be a logical impossibility for men. So what that is just it's basically like an inconsistency that cannot exist. So yeah, I'm pretty sure my point still stands. Like those things are just called impossibilities, as I already said. A contradiction itself, say for example, like a controlled contradiction, we can have something that's inconsistent but still make coherence out of it with apparent consistency. That's the point I was going for. But impossibilities cannot have any form of consistency because it's generally just impossible things which cannot have any sort of existence within these set frameworks. It's just a thing that cannot just issue yet.
I find it very, very comical that you are still hyperfixated upon something. But it's not even a hyperfixation. Because for something to be hyperfixated upon something, that says something that you're hyperfixated upon needs to exist. I didn't say that you were using the principle of explosion. I just clarified that principle of explosion does not lead to something being logical via different logical methods. Retard. That's the first thing that you made a blunder on. Like I don't get how you can like play over this recording multiple times and still fail to track what the fuck I was saying. Also, we wouldn't typically say that paraconsistent logic is applicable towards propositions or arguments. Paraconsistent logic is only applicable towards methodologies or some type of methodological framework that is applicable to some type of different or contrary logical framework, a contrary logical operation. And that logical operation is not something that is predicated upon a proposition or argument. So that's another blunder.
Okay, so yeah, to explain this real quick, the proposition was that I did have a piece of bread, right? And then that was the analogy which it was presented within the said framework, right? So within the framework there was a set within there, like there was a contrary statement within there, and there was a methodology to balance that contradiction and control it. So it was basically attributed to the composites within the said proposition, not necessarily corresponding to the proposition, but instead the composites within the said proposition and what was being asserted, not necessarily entailing or corresponding to the proposition itself, which is like an external thing to the composites, as the composites make up the totality of what the proposition is supposed to be asserting. As say, for an example, the proposition, I have an apple. Okay, so yeah, to explain this real quick, the proposition was that I did have a piece of bread, right? And then that was the analogy which it was presented within the said framework, right? So within the framework there was a set within there, like there was a contrary statement within there, and there was a methodology to balance that contradiction and control it. So it was basically attributed to the composites within the said proposition, not necessarily corresponding to the proposition, but instead the composites within the said proposition and what was being asserted, not necessarily entailing or corresponding to the proposition itself, which is like an external thing to the composites, as the composites make up the totality of what the proposition is supposed to be asserting. As say, for an example, the proposition, I have an apple in my hand, right? It can be true or false. A proposition value within it, right? Within these composites and so say a contradiction within there, it would be like a composite, like you find the proposition itself, right? So the composite would be an apple within the said proposition, right? And if there's a contradiction between P, and then we say this would be not P, right? The contradiction itself exists purely between within the proposition, and then makes an external thing, which would be not P. So it would be the totality of something. The So these composites, right, basically have a methodology over it. So you could fix something within the said proposition, not necessarily applying to the said proposition itself. So yeah, paraconsistency is a methodology that doesn't necessarily apply to the proposition itself, but the composites within the said proposition, not necessarily corresponding to the external like declarative statement, but the propositional value within. So say for an example, there's a contradiction within the said value of the proposition being asserted, the declarative statement between truth and false. The contradiction being a composite within this said declaration, not the declaration, declarative statement, right? So the contradiction exists within what is being asserted, and it makes a P not P. But if we apply the methodology of paraconsistency to the eternal aspect of it, it can apply to a framework where the proposition exists within. So the methodology is applying to the value, not necessarily the proposition itself within its totality. So to be exact, the proposition is asserted within the framework, right? We have a framework of what is being asserted, right? So that proposition is internal to that framework. It's not external because the bread is within that said framework, right? So the proposition having bread and not having bread, P and not P. So the proposition is internal to that framework, having the truth or false value. And by value, I mean that we can apply methodology to the value when it's a declarative statement with the truth and false value within the said framework. So it's not directly applying to the said proposition, but its value of truth or false, which if a contradiction is presented, a contradiction cannot exist by definition, but the proposition, but the not the proposition, but the value of itself. Like, if a contradiction is presented, we can automatically take it to be a false factor. But within that said value, if paraconsistent is applied that methodology to that logical operation within the said value in the framework of it, the proposition again being external to the value, because the said value is within the said proposition itself, truth or false, or the declarative statement. So the propositional value of it, rather than it is being applied to the proposition itself. So the methodology works upon the value within the framework, because if the contradiction is a composite of the said value itself, which it turns toward the false way, right? But if pair-consistent logic and that method is being applied to the said framework, or rather the internal proposition of value, we could say that the contradiction is controlled and therefore fixed within that set value itself, where we can lean towards the truth statement of that proposition. It's basically just a fixed contradiction. It coexists within the said propositional value, so it's not directly being applied to the proposition. There's a distinction between the value of something, the value of the proposition, and the proposition being asserted itself. Because we know the proposition is a declarative statement, something truth or false. The truth or false is within the said proposition, making it a value rather than it is just an asserted proposition, which is a declarative statement. So we have a distinction between the two, which doesn't make them the same. So the methodology would apply and is a composite of the said value rather than approaching the proposition or the declarative statement itself. Okay, so one more message before I go. So within propositional logic, right, we have a proposition being asserted. So we say P is going to be P, right? We can just grab the law of identity. I don't think that's any necessarily like external thing that matters. And he was referring to the propositional value in the proposition itself. The propositional value is going to be the declarative statement in which we have T and F, the both variables of the said proposition, where it's making a declarative statement which is going to be truth or false within that said proposition and framework. We have the proposition within it, right? So since we have that value and the contradiction is going to determine that value, so we know in propositional logic, um, contradictions are always going to be false, right? But a contradiction could be an inconsistent set within the set value, but that doesn't necessarily mean we are going to have a automatic false conclusion or anything in which we apply to that. The main argument is that paraconsistency can fix a contradiction itself. We could allow a contradiction to be there, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to make the entire proposition false by itself. So we could allow the contradiction to coexist within the said framework and propositional value, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to make a false assertion or always going to be a false because it doesn't become incoherent. It can refer to a coherent conclusion of the totality in the proposition we refer to. So the proposition we have in the methodology being applied to the value, we already made the distinction between the value and the proposition itself. So when we say P and not P, right? That doesn't necessarily mean when we apply paraconsistent logic, it's still going to be P and not P. We can say not P is going to exist within the framework, but that contradiction can be true. But Lee said paraconsistency allows for the contradiction to not let the logic create a logical explosion where anything can be, trivial from it. So the principle of explosion can go into conjunction with paraconsistent logic. Paraconsistent logic doesn't necessarily contribute to the principle of explosion. Is two distinct things because paraconsistency actually like prevents the principle of explosion within logic and propositional logic as well. So we can say we can have not P in there, but that doesn't necessarily mean P is going to equal to not P because there is a trial error within there, but we could fix that trial error and control it. So say for an example, it is raining, but it isn't raining. So we could say that it is raining within another part of the world, but it isn't raining within another part. Say for an example, New York City is going to have a rain, and the Middle East, I guess, is not going to rain because it's a hot desert. So that basically means that not P is there, but it's fixed by another set, which remains it consistent. So basically, not P is still within the set or the propositional value, but another set is going to make that set consistent thing in a composite of that and fix it the totality where the value of truth there is going to counteract or be counter initiated to the said always being false things. So the contradiction coexists with the consistent set which can control the set contradiction. So it's not always going to be false if we apply paraconsistency to that. Even though there is a trial of error and a contradiction is still present, paraconsistency doesn't let it explode like a normal contradiction would inherently determine it's always going to be false. It just throws a contradiction as an emphasis of set, which can lead to a coherent conclusion, as I already explained.